Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at the book of Proverbs, the book of wisdom. First of all, we had to talk about the title of the book. It's given in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1, where we read the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And that word Proverbs is actually taken from the root word mashal, which means to rule. So you could also describe it, I guess, as a book of rules. Rules for living, rules of common sense, rules of life. The passage goes on to say, verse 2, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The term about wisdom actually takes us back all the way to Exodus chapter 28, verses 2 through 3, where when Moses is giving the instructions on how to build not just the tabernacle, but the garments for Aaron, we read, and you shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother. This is actually God speaking to Moses. Holy garments for Aaron your brother, for glory and for beauty, and you shall speak to all the skillful persons whom I have endowed with and here's the term, the spirit of wisdom. Notice wisdom there wasn't just wise thinkings about how life works, but they had the spirit of wisdom so that they could do things like make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister as a priest to me. So God had actually given them the ability, the skill of, in this case, putting the garments together, the skill, I guess, of being a tailor or, a cloth maker. Likewise, when we speak of wisdom in the book of Proverbs, it's going to be the skill of living. So that term wisdom is certainly key to us. Now, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7 gives us what I think is perhaps the foundational principle for all the Proverbs that starts off here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and then its contrast. And we've already noted this, that when we look at poetic books, whether it's books of wisdom or other sorts of Hebrew poetry, that it's typically given in parallelism. So first we have the statement, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That's a good thing. And then its opposite, notice, fools despise wisdom and instruction. So we have the wise way and we have the foolish way. That's going to be a very common theme in the book of Proverbs. Two things we notice here. First of all, we ought to talk about the idea of the fear of the Lord. And this isn't a fear like the fear of a playground bully, a fear that drives away. Rather, this is a fear that draws us near. A fear that we could call brings wonder. Do you remember the story of Jesus when he's with his disciples on the Sea of Galilee and a storm comes up and they're afraid of the storm and they're not sure they really want to wake up Jesus because he's asleep in the back of the boat. But finally the storm is so much they wake him up because they're afraid, and sure enough he chews them out. But then he turns to the storm and he says to the storm, "Quiet!" And the storm gets quiet. And then we read, and then they were greatly afraid. Now they didn't, it wasn't like fear of a monster or fear of that caused them to jump out of the boat and try to swim to land, but rather they were asking, what kind of a person is this? It was a fear that brought wonder, and that's what the fear of the Lord is. It's the beginning, that kind of fear is the beginning of knowledge. Now, contrast between Psalms and Proverbs. In the book of Psalms, we saw a book of worship. Here in the book of Proverbs, we see a book of wisdom. In the Psalms, it speaks to our spirit. The Proverbs speaks to our intellect. In the Psalms, we saw life in the prayer closet. In fact, we suggested maybe Psalms are something which we ought to pray through the Psalms. I think we can pray through the Proverbs, but it's going to be a little bit different because the Proverbs gives us life out on the street. It tells us how to live on a day-by-day basis. If Psalms tells us how to worship on Sunday morning, Proverbs tells us how to live on Monday through Friday and Saturday too. In the Psalms, it teaches us how to be holy before God. The Proverbs teach us how to practice our holiness before men. The Psalms teach us about how we ought to love the Lord with your heart, with your soul, with your mind. And then the Proverbs come along and tell us to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we want to talk about the nature of wisdom literature. We've introduced this already in the book of Job, but we have a continuing aspect here as we come to the Proverbs, this idea of wisdom literature. We ought to note that there's a sense in which it stands apart from God's covenants. In other words, there's not going to be a lot of reference to the covenants that God has made and sacrifices and offerings. And once in a while we'll see that, but it's not really about that. It's not really a covenantal sort of thing. It's just telling us how life works. There's no mention made of Moses or Israel. There's no mention made of the temple or tabernacle, except maybe in passing. I think this book is inspired, but the nature of its inspired message isn't to say, "Thus saith the Lord," but rather it gives us lessons that we observe. We look at life and we see how life works, and that is the nature of its inspired message. It utilizes observation of nature instead of "Thus saith the Lord." We see this alluded to perhaps in Hebrews chapter 1 verse 1, which tells us that in many different ways, at many different times, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets. And of course, when we think about some of the ways that God spoke, he spoke to Moses through theophanies, and in which Moses would see some sort of manifestation. You can't really see God, but he would see some manifestation, whether it was a burning bush or the what we call the Shekinah glory or things like that. With the prophets, we had various sorts of spiritual communication, where God would make himself known through the prophets. But here, when we come to the sages, and that's the type where we're speaking of wisdom literature, the sages, they make insightful observations. They look at life and they observe and they reflect, and then they tell us the truths that they have seen. For example, Proverbs chapter 24, verses 30 and 31, where the writer says, "I passed by the field of the sluggard," that's the lazy person. We don't usually use that word sluggard today, although I think it's a great word. "I passed by the field of the sluggard, and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense." Notice, again, parallelism. He's passing by the field, by the vineyard. The sluggard and the man lacking sense, that's the same, two different descriptions of the same person. Verse 31, "And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles." I just looked, and its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. "And when I saw, I reflected upon it." I thought about it. I looked, and I received instruction. And here's the instruction that he receives, verse 33. "A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest." It's almost given like a little chant. And here's the result, verse 34. "Then your poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man." You don't need to go out and get mugged. When you're lazy, you sort of mug yourself. You don't need somebody to break in and steal. When you're lazy, you steal from yourself. And that's the point of the reflection of the proverb. Now, we do have an outline of the book of Proverbs. First of all, the first 9 chapters, and we looked at the first few verses in chapter 1. But after that we could almost call that the preamble. After that, we have in the rest of chapter 1 and all the way to the end of chapter 9 an appeal to wisdom. That is, be wise. It's going to begin. The whole first 9 chapters is why you ought to have wisdom, why you ought to be wise, as opposed to being something else. What's the opposite of wisdom? Whatever it is, don't go there. You don't want to go there. And at times, foolishness is going to be personified. But wisdom is personified and calling out to you and saying, here's why you want this. And then we turn to chapter 10, verse 1. And it starts off, these are the Proverbs of Solomon. And it begins a whole series of what are generally one-verse maxims, where it gives us one verse, usually with 2 lines. And although they are sometimes strung together, more often than not, they are sort of standalone. That is, sometimes there's a common theme from one proverb to the next, but each one can be taken and will give its own truth. And that takes us all the way to the end of chapter 24. Now, when we come to chapter 25, we're still in one-verse maxims, but this time we start off, these are the Proverbs that were collected by the men of Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah lived a long time after Solomon, so that suggests to us that maybe Proverbs, as Psalms were, the Proverbs were collected at different points along the way. That this was not a book that all came into being with one author sitting down and writing the whole thing from beginning to end, but rather they were a collection, some from Solomon, some later. They still could have been collecting some of the Proverbs of Solomon. We're not told who the author is in all those, but they were collected by the men of Hezekiah, beginning chapter 25 through 29. And then in chapter 30, we have reference to somebody named Agar. This is the the sayings or the Proverbs of Agar in chapter 30, and these are a bit larger couplets. That is, they go for more than a verse or two. They actually span a little bit more. They're developed a bit more. And then we have the words of King Lemuel in chapter 31. We're not sure who that is either. Some have even wondered, gee, is that just another name for Solomon? I suppose it could be, but we can't say for sure. And especially at the end of that, we're going to see some proverbs that are a long series that are strung together, and they're about the good woman. And they're not only on the same theme, but those proverbs in particular are going to be an acrostic, because each line takes us through, it begins with the Hebrew letter Aleph, and then the next letter, Hebrew letter Beth, and the next letter Gimel, and so on. What we would go through, we would say A, B, C, D, E. Then we go Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet, Hebrew alphabet. But there's an acrostic there with each proverb beginning with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it takes us through the whole Hebrew alphabet in those proverbs of the good woman. So that's a general outline of Proverbs. Now, some themes that we see in Proverbs. First of all, the way of wisdom, and we've already said this is really a book about wisdom. This is seen, for example, in those introductory, chapters 1 through 9. Remember, we said is the call for wisdom. In chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, we read, "I have directed you in the way of wisdom. I have led you in upright paths. When you walk, your steps will not be impeded, and if you run, you will not stumble." To say, verse 13, "Take hold of instruction, do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not proceed in the way of evil men. Avoid it, do not pass it by. Turn away from it and pass on, for they cannot sleep unless they do evil." You ever know somebody that just, they've always got to be doing evil. They've always got to be trying to getting other people into trouble. And they are robbed of sleep unless they make someone stumble. There are those that are like that, and you want to avoid those kinds of people. "For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the righteous, by contrast, is like the light of dawn that shines brighter and brighter until the full day." There are some folks that can just light up a room by walking into it, both emotionally but also in a wise way. Their wisdom, just if you let it, sort of rubs off on you. Verse 19, "The way of the wicked is like darkness. They don't know over what they stumble." You don't want to be in darkness. You want to be in light. "My son, give attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your sight. Keep them in the midst of your heart. For they are life to those who find them, and health to all their whole body. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life." What's on the inside is important. So be careful what you put there. We have this old computer saying, goes way back. I'm not sure how far I've been hearing it my whole life. Garbage in, garbage out. Watch what you put inside of you, because that's going to be important. That's going to eventually come out. And so you be careful about that. It not only gives us the way of wisdom, another big theme are principles of work. Again, let's look at some of those. "Ill-gotten gains do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death." Now, that's a sort of a proverb unto itself. But notice how several of these are strung together. So we start off, "Ill-gotten gains do not profit, righteousness delivers from death." Here's another one, again related to work. "The Lord will not allow the righteous to hunger, but he will thrust aside the cravings of the wicked." Verse 4, "Poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich." There's something about not quitting and continuing that very often pays off. Now, we want to say that, there can be exceptions to that, but normally good work gives good results. Yes, there are exceptions to that, but these are principles of work. "He who gathers in summer is a son who acts wisely, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who acts shamefully." When there's work to be done, go out and do it, and that's a good thing. There's something wise there. "Like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the lazy one who sends them." You ever have a subordinate working for you, and they grate your teeth. They're blowing smoke in your eyes, as it were. It just makes your eyes want to water. and you really wish you didn't have to have that one working for you. And obviously, when you're reading that, you not only want read this through the eyes of an employer, you also don't want to be the employee that's like that either. So you can come at this proverb a few different ways, from a few different directions. Do you see a man skilled in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men. There's something about skilled work. Well, the word gets out after a while, and you want that kind of person working for you. There have been certain types of especially automotive work and things that I can't do at all, but things where when I find somebody that can do it, not only do I continue going back to that person to whenever I need that kind of work done, I'm going to tell my friends and coworkers and others about it, so that they will go and get their work done by that person too. There's something about skill that tends to make a name for itself. Skill. Here's two principles related to these principles of work. Skilled work will lead to success, and also notice diligent work will lead to success. They're not quite the same thing. Skilled work is working smart, and diligent work is not giving up and getting it done. And both those are good qualities to have in your work. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 19, the way of the sluggard is as a hedge of thorns, but the path of the upright is a highway. Would you rather have to walk through a bunch of thorns in your way, or would you rather have a nice, easy, clear-cut highway in life? You get to decide by the kind of work you do. Go to the ant, O sluggard, Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Go to the ant, O sluggard. Notice the observance idea here. Observe her ways and be wise, which having no chief officer or ruler prepares her food in the summer and gathers her provision in the harvest. You ever watch ants? They just seem to be always in motion. So it makes a good illustration for working all the time. You don't have, the ant doesn't have another ant just watching over its shoulder saying, turn right, turn left, don't forget to pick this up. No, they seem to be very industrious in the way they do. And that's the point of the proverb. Principles of business and finance. Now this is related to work too, but here's one, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 27 through 28. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. There's a chain on that. Verse 28 repeats that idea, illustrates that idea. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it, when you have it with you. In other words, pay your debts now. If you owe something, pay it now. Don't put it off. Don't string people along. Be known as one who pays his debts, who fulfills his obligations. He who trusts in his riches will fall. Now, we've been talking about work and business and finance. You would think, well, that means you want money and you want a lot of it. But notice, he who trusts in his riches, this is Proverbs 11:28, he who trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like the green leaf. So it's not just about getting money. In fact, that can lead to failure. But it's about doing the right thing. And that will lead to success, a really successful life. Principles of spiritual speech. Here's one, Proverbs chapter 26, verse 20. For lack of wood, the fire goes out, but where there is no whisperer, contention quiets down. Notice how those two are related. One of the ways, and I was a firefighter for a long time, so I know all about fire. And one of the ways you put out a fire is taking away its fuel. So they didn't have, things like petroleum and the sorts of, plastic fuels that we have, but one of the common fuels was wood. And you take away the wood and the fire goes out. You take away the thing that's burning and the fire goes out. And likewise, you take away gossip, you take away the whisperer, the one who's sort of, can I say it, adding fuel to the fire, and contention has a way to die out just like that dying fire. Drive out the scoffer. This is Proverbs 22, verses 10 through 14. A whole string of Proverbs dealing with things we say. Notice this. Drive out the scoffer, and contention will go out. Even strife and dishonor will cease. That's a proverb unto its own. You get rid of the one who's always making fun, who is mocking others, and contention has a way of going away. Verse 11, he who loves purity of heart and here's speech. Remember, this is Proverbs dealing with what you say. He who loves purity of heart and whose speech is gracious, the king is his friend. Again, there's something, watch what you say. Verse 12, the eyes of the Lord preserve knowledge, but he overthrows the words of the treacherous man. So it's, again, things that you say that are in view there. Verse 13, the sluggard says, so notice again things you say, the sluggard says, there's a lion outside, I shall be slain in the streets. Now when he says that, the idea is that he's making an excuse. There's not really a lion outside, although there were lions in the ancient world, but they usually weren't waiting outside in the city street or right outside your house. So he's using an excuse. The sluggard says, there's a lion outside, I'll be slain in the streets. And the idea is, so therefore I'm not going to work. I'm not going to get out of bed, I'll just stay here. Verse 14, the mouth of an adulteress is a deep pit. Don't listen to what she says, because look at the way she lives. The mouth of an adulteress is a deep pit. He who is cursed of the Lord will fall into it. And that's not a good thing. That won't have a good outcome either. A wise son accepts his father's discipline, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. Things that are said. We need to listen to discipline. We need to listen to rebukes. Because when we do, there's wisdom there. We can learn from them. It's not easy to do, but important to listen to such things. Verse 2 and we're in Proverbs 13, verses 1 through 3. Verse 2, from the fruit of a man's mouth, he enjoys good, but the desire of the treacherous is violence. So, what does one say? Is it good? Is it violence? Listen up. Verse 3, the one who guards his mouth preserves his life. Sometimes there's great benefit in watching your words and then saying nothing. But the one who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. More often we regret what we did say than what we didn't. Now I'm not saying that's always the case, but there's an old saying that says it goes, the wise man is known for his scarcity of words. The fool, he opens his doubt and he opens his mouth and removes all doubt. Probably mess up the proverb. But the same idea here. He who guards his mouth preserves his life, and the one who opens his widest lips comes to ruin. In fact, back in World War II, they used to have a saying, open lips sink ships. Sometimes saying things, ill-advised things, can bring to ruin. In Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 13, as I said, we see this proverb of the excellent wife. And in just summarizing up some things about her, this good woman, she conducts her affairs in such a way as to instill trust on the part of her husband. He can trust her. He knows that she's got his good welfare, and she's using wisdom, and he doesn't have to be watching over her shoulder because she's doing well. She's both hardworking, she's efficient, her husband is clothed appropriately. They're not afraid of the cold weather because the husband and the children, they're all clothed appropriately in a good way. She's hardworking, she's efficient, she's not afraid to engage in business. It says she sees a field, she buys it, she purchases it. She's not just sitting at home idle. Praise is given to both her husband as well as to her. Both her name and her husband's name are voiced in the city gates. You can imagine her husband speaking her name in the gates of the city. Let me just say, I speak really highly of my wife. My wife is a wonderful wife, and I praise her name in the gates of the city and speak well of her. And because of her, my name also is praised, and people speak well of me and of the marriage that we have. And I chose wisely a good wife to have, a most excellent wife. Now, some lessons that we can learn from the Proverbs. First of all, there's a universal need for wisdom. Everybody needs to be wise. And we can especially see that when we think about wisdom. Sometimes we think about Solomon, who had great wisdom, but didn't always use wisdom. And wisdom can be applied in every area of life, whether you're young or old, whether you're work or retired or a student getting ready for future labors, whether you're at church on Sunday morning or at work on Monday through Friday, or maybe just at home on Saturday, or anywhere in between. There's a universal need for wisdom. Secondly, there's a universal arena of wisdom. That is, wisdom encompasses every area of life. No matter where you go, wisdom is applicable. Thirdly, what is wise is also what is good. You see, sometimes we differentiate between wisdom versus goodness and righteousness, as if they are two different things. In fact, there was a book written way back in the Renaissance area called The Prince by Machiavelli. And this was considered to be a wise book, but nobody thought it was a good book, because he talked about how the one who is in charge ought to lie and steal and cheat and do whatever he can to just get ahead. Sounds a little bit like modern day America. And that's not what we see in the Proverbs. The Proverbs tell us that it is wise to do what's right, because in the long term, that is better. Another lesson we see from the Proverbs is that, well, it's been asked whether the Proverbs contain principles or promises. And so I call this lesson principles rather than promises, but let me just put an artificial question mark at the end of that. Are they principles? Are they promises? As we noted, sometimes there are exceptions to them. And so for this reason, I used to say that the Proverbs give us principles rather than promises. But I'm not sure that's quite accurate. Let me change that a bit, because I think there are promises here. You say, wait a minute. For example, there's a promise to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. You say, wait a minute, I can think of exceptions of people who trained up children the way they should go, and they got old, and they went over the hill, and they went and did some really bad things. And I would say that's still a promise, but what we have to do is take all the Proverbs, in fact, all the Scriptures, and weigh them. No one proverb gives all the story. No one proverb tells the whole truth. The Proverbs are true, but we have to weigh them and sometimes hold them in tension. So I think there are promises as well as principles there, but we have to take all the Proverbs together. And the Proverbs are going to teach us that, yes, there are these general principles and even general promises, but sometimes there are exceptions to the rule too. And so we'll see that, especially when we come to some more of the wisdom literature. We already saw that with Job. We're going to see it next with Ecclesiastes. Proverbs give us a real view of the real world. They tell us how things really are, and sometimes they just talk about the nitty-gritty of life, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. This is just the way it is. The Proverbs do that. It also, and I'm borrowing a phrase from one of my old professors, Steve Brown, who described it this way: Christians are called to be street smart. I like the way he said it, so I'm going to share it with you too. We ought to be, as Jesus said, wise as serpents, harmless as doves. Yes, but don't forget the wisdom part. We ought to be smart. We ought not to be silly about life. Finally, and maybe we'll come back to this when we look at some of the other wisdom literature, Proverbs, I'm going to suggest, have a basic approach to life. Largely, this is what we see in the Proverbs, and yet, I've just noted that there are exceptions to the rule. And the Proverbs give us some of those exceptions, but also for those exceptions, we go to other parts of the poetic books. We go, for example, to the book of Job, where we see the righteous suffer. Even though sometimes we do what's right, there's other things that take place that bring suffering. And that doesn't negate the truth of the Proverbs that gives us this basic approach to life. But there are those instances, I'm going to call them the exceptions, where the righteous suffer. Another exception is seen in Ecclesiastes, where we see described sort of there's a sense in which there's a lack of meaning to life. Now we're going to come to the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, and that's not the big idea at the end. There's a bigger idea, but there's a sense in which we can look at life, and you're born in one hospital and die in another, and try not to mess up too much in between, and there's certain things that just seem a bit empty, at least from the under the sun perspective down here, and that's not negating the truth of the Proverbs. In fact, Ecclesiastes is going to give us some wisdom, some good wisdom about life and how it works, even though sometimes you look at it and you say, I can't figure it out, but there's still some good things we can learn there. A third exceptional book, and I'm not sure if I should include this, but I'm going to anyway, so don't beat me up too bad, but I'm going to talk about Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon. And maybe we see in there a bit of the irrationality of love, in that Proverbs talk about, man and woman relationships, but then we get to the Song of Solomon, and we just fell head over heels in love. And that's okay. There's something special about that. So we're going to have a delightful time in looking at that book as well.